Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Charvak podcast. This is your host, Kushal Mehra. My guest today is Dr. Koenraad Elst. Dr. Elst is an Indologist, a sinologist. He's also very well versed in philosophy, and he's a man who I want to start today's podcast by admitting that it's my fault. I should have had Dr. Elst on my podcast a long time ago. I've been a huge follower and a fan of his work, but well, better late than ever. So, first of all, Dr. Elst, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Yes, glad to be here. Thanks for your interest.
So guys, today's podcast is going to be in a slightly different format. So, as Dr. Elst and I were having a slight discussion on our email. So he was kind enough to tell me, Kushal, would you want me to give you guys a little bit of a small presentation or a primer where I can explain to you the principles of linguistics and what the out of India theory is and what the Aryan Invasion theory is? And I was like, why not? It would be a great opportunity for all of us to actually learn from Dr. Elst firsthand what are the principles of linguistics and what are those principles that are then extrapolated from and presented in the form of the Aryan invasion theory. So, guys, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to be putting a presentation on the screen for all of you, and Dr. Elst will first go through the presentation, and then all of you who have questions can ask the questions, and we can all including myself, and we can all have our questions answered in the second half of the discussion. So, Dr. Elst, I'm going to be putting up the screen the PowerPoint on the screen right now, and I hand it over to you.
Right.
You can go ahead, Dr. Elst.
Can I go ahead? Okay, here we
Yeah.
go. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about a specific language family here, the Indo European language family, of which both Sanskrit and English are members. And in fact, most North Indian and most European languages are members. So a language family, not a number of branches, and so ultimately languages altogether descend. This is some people think it's constructing a ghost shoe science that nobody has ever seen or heard. Indo-European united language, Sanskrit and Russian and Greek and so on, all descend. True, it's an ambitious project to go reconstruct something that hasn't been attested, but it's not that far-fetched, because we see this happening all the time in our own life, that if a community speaking one language goes to live apart, those languages start to differ more and more. They become mutually non-understandable. If English had split up in Canadian and British and also Indian English, and had not remained in contact constantly, thanks to the modern media, then those different forms of English would be far apart already. We know a specific case fully documented, namely the Romance language family, which is one branch of the Indo language family, that we can trace back to a common origin, namely Vulgar Latin. And so this Vulgar Latin we know thanks to the graffiti found in archaeological sites of the Romans, particularly in the places covered by volcano lava, Herculaneum and Pompeii. So we know the difference between the colloquial Latin and the Latin of the scriptures. And so it's from that Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. And we see a number of typical features of language development. One is that they simplify the original language. For example, in Roman, you had plural formations ending either in a vowel. Spanish, for instance, and in French, in a vowel have disappeared. In languages like Italian, there the opposite happens. It's the forms in S that you see is borrowing from neighboring languages. Like Romanian is quite different from languages, both words and sentence patterns, whereas it's mostly borrowed from Germanic, especially from and Spanish similarly has borrowed a lot from Arabic. So that's what happened on a far larger scale. This is not entirely an exercise up in the air. It's no ghost language, as they say. Tested texts in a number 1500 BC, Athenian Greek and Hittite, and also Vedic. Most Western scholars that the Vedas are also from about 1500 to 1200 BC. We will see that this is a much too low estimate, that the Vedas easily go back beyond 2000 BC. So that's even closer to European. And here, of course, but it is estimated at about 3. So that's when Sanskrit, Greek, and so on were still only one language. Now, some people say, oh, this is all a race in a colonial conspiracy and so on. Language family was not Indo-European, it was Uralic. So this was already mapped out in the century. The reconstruction was complete, and it's about the Samoyedic. So a number of languages in Northern Europe and Northern. Now all the people who spoke them within were white. The scholars who mapped it out were white. The neighboring countries, competing with the Uralic speakers for territory and so on, they were also white. So race was at all. And the same thing counts initially for Indo-European. So the Indo-European language family unites most Indian and European languages. You can see here in red the Germanic languages.
Dr. Elst, you'll have to click brown, on the slide individually. That slide has not come up.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Well, okay, here we go. Yes, can you see it now with the map?
No, Dr. Elst, I can't see it right now with the map.
Can't?
No, I don't know. For some odd reason, the
slide. This one, can you see?
No, it's not coming up. How do we work around this, Dr. Elst? Or can you email me the slide and I come up with it, or I share it from my computer? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, of course I can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know, your slides are not. So when you're changing the slides, they're not coming up on my computer over here or anybody else's.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, Technology has its own mysteries. Okay.
Or Dr. Elst, how about this?
You can see them now?
Just, yes, now I can see them. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's not full screen, but at least you can see them, all right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see
So
them
can
now.
we go on like this?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Right, so you can see there the, yeah, so you can see the Uralic language family in Northern Europe, Northern Asia. So that's all white, racially speaking. So there are no racial angle. These were not colonies nor colonizers. So all these arguments wave off the Indo-European argument simply are not applicable there. Now in Indo-European, initially, they are not applicable either. So here on this map, and this time I hope you see it, you can see
Yeah, I can.
in
Yeah,
red the Germanic, brown the Romance languages, light green the Baltic languages, then light green, light blue, and below in is Greek, in purple a small one is Armenian. In Irish group, it makes sense to split them into two, Iranian and Indo-Aryan. Are not mentioned on the map because they are extinct, namely the Anatolian or Hittite branch in Anatolia, then the Tocharian branch in the western part of the People's Republic, in Xinjiang, is in Bulgaria and western Anatolia. And a very important one, very, very, very small, is Proto Bangani, spoken in Uttarakhand, in Kumaon, in the lower hills of the Himalaya. So in India, consists only of a few dozens of words existing as a substrate, as a remainder of an earlier language within the local dialect of Hindi. And so if you study, it turns out to be a much older form of language, not at all typical for the Indo-Aryan languages. So it's a grouping in itself, and it has left enough traces in the contemporary language. So linguists can study it. So the story starts with the fellow in the William Jones. He was, and he worked for the British East Indies in Kolkata. And so the official birth of speech he gave for the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Kolkata in 1886. Now that was not the absolute birth in the sense that he didn't have the idea from himself. He didn't claim to. A few years earlier, a Jesuit working in South India called Gaston Laurent Coeur had sent the first mapping of the Indo-European language family to the French Academy. And though that text was not published, as far as I know, it was somewhat known, like the French intellectual referred to it. And so William Jones made it public. Now, the first inkling between European languages and Indian languages had already been voiced before by another Jesuit, Thomas Stevens, in 3, then by Filippo Sassetti, who I think by birth was Italian, but he worked for the Portuguese in Goa. And then by a Dutchman, Marcus Sirius von Boxhorn. Right, so you see, this was in the air because you can easily notice some similarities. You see, in the case of Filippo Sassetti, it will be between Portuguese or Italian on the one hand, and Marathi, Konkani on the other. And so when you compare news, do not exist between Tamil, for example. There you can see the Indian or Dravidian languages are a real language. So this new discovery was entirely in admiration of Sanskrit. William Jones recognized the insight in the commonality the key languages were to the discovery of, and it was commonly assumed that therefore also Sanskrit was the mother tongue from which all the others sprang, and India was the homeland from where people had taken this language to Europe, and in an evolved form it had become Russian and Greek and German and everything. This new language family was called Indo European since the beginning of the 19th century, or Aryan. The term Aryan in this meaning is from Friedrich Schlegel in 1808. He wrote a book in extinct Romania. India was praised to the skies, and they wanted to deduce European civilization from Indian civilization. That's a very strong. However, he was not the first to use the word Aryan. It had been used in 1971 by Duperron. If you care to know, the father of academic Indology. And in there he had started using the word Aryan, which he thought applied to Indo-Iranians, both to Iranians and Vedic Indians. But he did not yet think connecting this with Greek and Germanic and Latin and so on. So that larger Indo-European perspective was brought by Friedrich Schlegel. So, some people will object that the idea of these language family, that this is just imagination. So, this commonality is explained at length and in a few technical books that students and many others have had to work through. But for doubting Hindus, no, Tamil is more related to Sanskrit, and what are these ugly French and Germans and Russians doing here? The best explanation you can find blogspot of Shrikant Talageri, talageri.blogspot.com. And so one of his more recent pages from January this year, January 2021, is about Indology, and it's about the tendency among Hindus to say, oh yeah, the Western scholars didn't know anything about it, and they have it all wrong, and it was a conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. He shows, no, you see, whatever else was wrong with them, that is not it. There really is an Indo-European language family, and yes, French is much closer, yeah, French, for example, German, Russian are much closer to Sanskrit than Tamil is. Tamil, from the viewpoint of Sanskrit, is a really foreign language. Later, Tamil a lot. And so there's a lot of similarity between Tamil and Sanskrit, or even more between Tamil and modern Indo-Aryan language. But that's of that doesn't make the languages cognate. It's like if you marry someone who is not your family, you two are going to more and more resemble one another. Still, that doesn't make you brother and sister. Right. So the man in the photograph is Friedrich von Schlegel. He's the one who idealized and deduced everything from India. It was not entirely new. There was already an Indomania in the air in Europe. So we have all about the first, and so he himself very explicitly said that European civilization comes from the banks of Ganga. Similarly, Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, Johann Herder, who is in fact the great theorist of nationalism, and the French historian Jules Michelet. And so that attitude, and similarly the idea that India was the land of origin, remains dominant till about 1840. So the out of India theory was for more than half a century the only game in town. Some people may have thought, well, we won't know, everything is possible, but all those who had an opinion thought that the land of origin was India. So, and if now it seems that some immigrants from India took this language to Europe and then in different forms after a lot of these became. And it's only after that that the so-called Aryan Invasion theory came about. Around 1990, the out of India theory was revived, mainly at the initiative of Indians, but not exclusively. The term out of India theory was not in use in 1800. It was coined by Edwin Bryant, an American scholar who belongs to the Hare Krishna movement, in about 1997. In 1934, the Homeland started shifting. It took some time before this caught on in the public imagination, but it started in 1884 when August von Schlegel, who was the von Schlegel whom we mentioned, posits a homeland outside India, namely in the Caucasus. Now, the Caucasus itself is not really a good choice because in a mountain chain, not many people, not enough to, after emigration, populate the whole expanse from the Atlantic Ocean to the Bay of Bengal. The Caucasus Mountains, where a lot and practice agriculture, where now you have Russia and Ukraine. Now, this proved to become a major factor in the racialization of the concept of or Indo-European originally. See the Caucasus Mountains, Johann Blumenbach in about as the homeland of the white race. That's why in America, in the racial classification that is used there, Caucasian means white, right? So Schlegel didn't say it in so many words, but the connection nevertheless was made between the homeland of Indo European and the homeland of the white race. And so very easily these two were identified. Now, the out of India theory didn't give up like that. So it was defended against the new steppe homeland theory, even by several professors in and Mount Stuart Elphinstone. He had been the governor of Bombay within the British colonial setup. So he was as colonialist as you can get. Yet, you see, he defended the out of India theory against the rising Aryan invasion. Idea of the area north of the Caucasus Mountains as the homeland, that caught on, you see, that went into the public imagination. Several other westerly homelands have been tried, like northern Germany, like Belarus, like the Balkans, like Anatolia. There is even a theory that says the Indo-Europeans came from Atlantis. Why not? Although mostly Western Europe was excluded. No Europeans came from Spain or from France or from England or so. They always come from the East. But how far in the East? No, that's a point for discussion. But you see, most people settled for this north of the Caucasus because it seems at first sight so, it's neatly in the middle. From there, people could migrate to the west and to the east, more or less with the same effort. So it seems, for people who don't know anything about this, it seems logical. Because you could think that it's the most economical solution. It takes the least special pleas. Now, in reality, that's not how things happen, but it took some time before people thought of this. Namely, when you look at all countries who have expanded very far, you can see that all of them have expanded from a far corner in the middle. For example, Russian started in Kiev, which is now the capital of Ukraine, went a little east, and then went all the way, all through Siberia to Alaska. That's how far Russian went. So it started in one far corner. It never went west of that far corner. Why not? Well, Russians could emigrate all they want, but they ended up in Poland or in Germany, where already a language was spoken. And it was, used for lawmaking and for literature and for education. So if you went, well, very automatically, you would get into the existing language. Whereas in Siberia, you had a few scattered tribes, so it didn't make much difference. So you could keep your Russian language and spread it farther and farther all the way to Alaska. Similarly, when Arabic spread with the Muslim conquests, it spread from Arabia to Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania. It went to reach the ocean. It couldn't go farther. Whereas it didn't go east at all. In Africa, you have the Bantu languages. They started in West Africa, Nigeria, thereabouts. They were the first in Africa to use agriculture. And with agriculture, you can control your own food supply. It's very for keeping your children alive. So it's demographically very good. But you see, wanted to practice agriculture, they could go southeast, and they did. They went all the way to South Africa. The Xhosa language in South Africa, spoken by Nelson Mandela, is a Bantu language, although influenced by the Khoisan languages that are native to South Africa. But so they only spread southeast. They did not go north. Why? Because north there is the Sahara Desert. You can't practice agriculture there. So circumstances normally create a pressure on people spread in one direction. The circumstances, natural circumstances, are not symmetrical, and so migrations are not symmetric. And as well, migration here was not symmetrical. And so it is not logical if they started in a country with a, if in India something happens, whether it is a famine or a civil war or some kind of crisis that forces many people to emigrate, then even a very small emigration by Indian standards can make a huge difference in the end. Whereas the other way around, if a band of horse-born young men from Central Asia invades India, well, maybe they can score a few military successes, but then you see they settle down, they marry local women, and they throughout history. You see, in Indian history, you have the Scythian or Shaka invasions, the Hunas, the Greeks, the Kushanas, then the Turks, the Arabs, and so on. You have immigrations of refugees, the Parsis, the Syrian Christians, and they all assimilated. Even the Muslim invaders, who were in very large numbers and who had an ideology of separatism, of keeping themselves separate from the natives, nevertheless took to a language that is a variation on Hindi. Urdu is essentially Hindi with a Persian input. They didn't in Persian or Turkish or Arabic. When these so-called Aryans supposedly entered India, well, there may have been an influx. There may have been invasions in India, but there is no indication. Not only they could maintain their language, but they even managed to impose their language on a far, far larger and far more cultured native Indian population. But so anyway, the situation we have to deal with is this, as a Proto Indo European gradually gave way for, if they had to end up in India, they had to invade India. Today, it is deemed bad form to speak crudely of an conquest and so on. They insist that you say now enter a country, adapt country, and citizens of the existing establishment, and therefore lose their language and take to the local language. That's certainly not what happened in the case of the so-called Aryan Invasion. In Aryan Invasion, they managed to impose their language, impose their religion on the natives who completely lost it, right? So that's a scenario that I would call invasion, even if it were not by military means. And if you scratch immigrationists, they really are invasionists. they end up listing the military advantages that the Aryans supposed them, which made it possible for them to conquer India. Namely, they are supposed to have brought the horse and chariot. Now, in the Rig Veda, you have wagons from the very beginning. You have carts, ox carts, and even very large wagons, holding 9 people. That's said explicitly. But chariots only make their appearance at the very end of the Rig Veda. So if the Rig Veda was brought by invaders, they had perforce to come without chariots and then develop chariots in India. At any rate, now we have chariots in Sinaudi from about 2000 BC, which is before the supposed Aryan Invasion, right? So that doesn't hold water. Anyway, so in the case of an invasion, all the other invasions that took place in Indian history, for instance, the Kushana invasion, Western UP, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and so on, all belong to the Kushana Empire. And yet there is no trace of a Kushana language left. Kushana board or something like there is law board. There's no one in India of whom you can tell, hey, you look like a Kushana. You must be a Kushana. Why are you not standing up Kushana? So if there was any invasion in 1500 BC, clearly they ended up assimilated. There's no indication for them maintaining their separate language. Anyway, so the Aryan Invasion theory gained in the mid-19th century, and part of the rationalization was also involving linguistic insight. So linguists came to the that Sanskrit was not the original Proto Indo European. You could not deduce Greek from Sanskrit. Instead, Sanskrit and Greek were sisters descending from a common mother. And so if there was a distance between Proto-Indo-European and Sanskrit, then it was inferred, not very logically, but okay, it was also be a distance between India. So the homeland was removed from India. All right. So the homeland took some turns, there were some experimental homelands, so to speak. In 1926, Gordon Childy strongly pleaded for Southwest Russia as the homeland. And now more or less everybody agrees on that. In the 90s, there was still an attempt to make Anatolia the home. That failed. In the 1970s, there was Maria Gimbuta, Lithuanian American, who made a case for the Indo-European, the Indo-Europeanization of Europe, starting from Southwest Russia. It's quite convincing. Indeed, I stand by that case. So she argues that the old European culture was more agricultural centered, was more modest centered, more matriarchal, and more peace. And that was overrun by the violent Aryan invaders coming from Russia. All the findings of archaeology genetics have confirmed Europe really was an Aryan invasion. And you do see around 2900, 2500, lots of new cultural findings, new types of pottery, new types of burial, new types of housing, and so on. And at the same time, a new human type. You find skeletons that are taller, and so on. All kinds of things have been written about it, and culture moved into Europe. And wherever you can continue these cultures down to the historical period, you see that they are all speaking Indo-European languages. No indication at all that they were anything else except the Indo-Europeans moving into Europe. So in Europe, you really had an Aryan, but made by many Western scholars is to project the same scenario onto India, where you do not find any indications. There are no indications. So the thing is that the homeland from which they came into elsewhere had settled. Here you have a name that is quite hated in India, Max Müller, Friedrich Max Müller. Or, you know, he gave himself a Sanskrit name. The in fact, he didn't invent much, not in this respect. You see, he was very creative, very undertaking concerning the translation and interpretation of the Oriental classics, you know, the Avesta, the Veda, the Homeland was there in to the step in Homeland theory. He brought that to England, and so his name, you know, for Indians is mostly associated with this Aryan invasion theory. Now, the Aryan invasion theory was not at all a concoction, as they say. You see, it had grown among scholars in some dusty library in Heidelberg or Berlin or somewhere. And then later, colonial administrators saw the use of it. And so they thought, you know, this was a very good justification of the British Empire being in India. Because they said, well, okay, we have invaded India, but so have the Indians. At least the upper caste North Indians, they have invaded long ago, 3,500 years ago, but still they have invaded. And so they're no better than us. They have no more right to this country than. Then in the course of the later 19th century, there was more and more an identification of Indo race, or even the white-most variety within the white race. That starts with de Gobineau, who was a French racial theorist, in fact, more or less the father of modern racism, in about 1855. And then it quite a few years later was the Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. And suddenly race came to explain everything. If there was a difference between two, because they were a different race. If there was a change in a particular country from one custom to another, it meant that there was a British Israeli who wrote many works that race is the key to all of history. So in that climate, many people spoke about the Aryan race, and they attributed certain characteristics to it. Like, for instance, they had to be dolichocephalic, have a long skull. As you may know, in 1939, the SS, the Nazi group, they sent an expedition to Tibet to find out if there aren't any remains of the Aryans in Tibet. And they're disappointed because the Tibetans are the most thick-skulled people in the world. They're very brachycephalic, having a broad skull. Okay, but so this identification was there. The length of the nose and so on, that was all material. Now, Max Müller had enough of this. And so, contrary to what many people in India think, Max Müller was not an advocate of this Aryan racism on and he said, you see, you can't link these two together because you can't speak of a dolichocephalic grammar, of a long-nosed nominative case or so. These are two different categories. They have nothing to do with one another. And actually, the scholars knew this since the beginning, because if you European languages, then clearly you are uniting the languages belonging to two different races, at least to two different skin colors. You see, either the origin of the language was in white territory and it entered brown territory and it got spoken by many brown people, or it started in brown territory and it entered white territory and was taken over by white people. But so at any rate, you can't identify this language with a race. So Max Müller was a guy. Okay, I have more to say, and in fact I have more stuff on PowerPoint, but I propose to interrupt here and check if there are any questions or objections.
Fair enough, Dr. Elst. So let's start taking a few questions because already there are quite a few of them. So I'm going to start randomly taking questions now. So the first one was, so somebody has asked, what about the hypothesis that the Brahmi script is in part derived from Aramaic script, which is in turn derived from the Phoenician script? Does that have any standing, and what kind of an emphasis would that have on the whole Aryan invasion, Aryan migration hypothesis too?
Well, not much, because that concerns a script, and a script can be used to render all kinds of languages.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see, the Cyrillic script for Russian is also used for Mongolian or for Tajik, or that are not related to Russian. So that doesn't prove anything. The Sanskrit script, the Devanagari script, or variations of it, have been used for Dravidian, for Thai, for a number of Southeast Asian languages. So this script doesn't say much. The first alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, dates to the 2nd millennium BC. That's like at least 2 millennia later, Proto Indo European. So, and in particular, there's an important debate about whether the Phoenician script isn't a resultant an evolute of the Harappan script. So that was the thesis of S.R. Rao, an Indian archaeologist writing in about 1990. Not much has been done with that as far as I know. But Subhash is also written in the same vein. But you see, nothing much has been heard from that current anymore. So I mean, it's not entirely impossible. But the usual explanation is that the Devanagari script coming from the Brahmi script, or the Brahmi script in turn, is also an evolute of the Phoenician script, just like Kharoshthi, only a little bit earlier. And the two are not recognizable to one another. But so that's the usual thing. Certainly, it is not thought hitherto that the origin of the script lies in Harappa. And so that's, I don't hold that impossible. Only you see the script controversy, the decipherment of the Harappan script is such a difficult thing, and there are so many proposals already. So I've decided, well, it's fine if somebody does that decipherment, but it's not something I want to do. And so at any rate, I don't think it is that decisive for the Homeland question.
All right. So I just want to follow up with now that we are on the script. So the Indus Valley script, and I remember reading a blog you had written detailing all the different decipherments of the Indus Valley script, from it being kind of Proto-Dravidian to, Proto-Indo something between Proto-Indo European and the classical Sanskrit. I remember you had written a detailed blog. So as we stand today, how hopeful are you to solving, when do you think we're going to be solving the Indus Valley script conundrum? Because we seem to be all over the place. And if you were to hedge your bets on someone's work, which one would that be?
Well, you see, the question of the script is, of course, the only thing that still holds us back from triumphalism. You see, I think the out of India theory has been sufficiently proven. It's just that, well, I still hold my horses, because you never know what may come out of that interview. And so actually, I shouldn't perhaps leave it to others to come up with something. Maybe it is important enough to busy myself with it, but at any rate, yeah, it can make a big difference. Like, for instance, a question is, does it represent one language? Now, the first question even is, does it represent a language at all? Because some people like Steve Farmer and Michael Witzel, they deny that it's a language at all. They say, you see, there are no lengthy inscriptions. We look at the hieroglyphs in Egypt. There are entire walls filled with book-length inscriptions. So there are whole texts in this Egyptian language. There are none in the Harappan language. There are only short inscriptions, logos, and mostly they are on seals. You see, seals that used to be attached to sacks full of grain or of wood or any commercial implement. So it is probable that these were logos of companies or calling cards of tradesmen, and not necessarily having the form of a script. It is like if you are in a multilingual country and you see a sign on the road, a red sign with a white line in it. You may say it is Singapore, you may be speaking English or Chinese or Tamil, but for all of them, this means the same thing. It means stop. And you can't drive here. So, it could be something similar. Now, on the other hand, you see, I don't, for easy solutions. So I challenge of seeing this as a language, but then still, it is not certain that this is one language. You look at Mesopotamia, smaller territory than the Indus Sarasvati territory, but already have 5 or so different languages, partly in the same script. You see, the cuneiform script adopted for Sumerian was also used for Akkadian, was then also used for Hittite, and so on. Different languages, not cognate to one another. And so it is quite possible that in the northern part of the Indus area, Punjab, Haryana, it represented Indo-Aryan, and on the coast, it represented Dravidian, and maybe somewhere in the west, like in Sindh, it represented yet something else. And, this is perfectly possible, and we don't know. It doesn't make much difference for the homeland question, but it's an interesting question. It must get an answer. Now, it so happens that in this regard, I am of the optimistic type. You see, I'm confident that the script will not so hard to do. I mean, I have easy talking, I haven't done it, but nevertheless, I'm quite sure it's not that hard to do. And it's not a language totally in the unknown. Like in Europe, you have a script from 5000 BC, the Vinsha script, which is just like the Indus script. There's a number of signs, we can't read them. We are sure that they represent a language, but they probably do. We assume that the language is some kind of Hatti. Hatti was the language spoken before the Hittite invasion of Anatolia. And that was probably the language of the Neolithic revolution, that is to say, the language of the first agriculturists. So when they had filled up Anatolia, they went to greener pastures, so to speak. They went into the Balkans, up to the Danube River. And so there they started this Vinsha civilization. Therefrom, we have the oldest script in the world, which is now about 7,000 years old, 5,000 BC. And so there we don't know at all. We don't know what language it represents, and we have no chance of finding anything contemporary that would give an indication. The situation in Harappa is different, because there we have languages approaching it in time and space. So probably we'll find something. I'm confident of that. But I don't have the answer. Yeah.
All right. So Dr. Elst, a lot of people have been asking this question. So I'll kind of, plug them all together. So the dating of Indian scriptures, whether it's the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, whether it's the Rig Veda, even when it comes to the Rig Veda, so now how old are the old mandalas, the old books, and how old are the new books? And then the dating of the Arthashastra. It's just been an evergreen back and forth between people from the West, Indologists in the West, and scholars in India, where there are some folks in India who date the Rig Veda right up to 20,000 BCE, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata to 12,000 BCE. So how do we decipher the date? So what could be the possible criteria that we go through when we go about deciding the date of a scripture?
Yeah, well, there's a big argument about the Mahabharata. There you have many indications, so it's a very lively debate, and it's a debate that promises to have an ending. Much more, we know that Rama was a historical character. He's in the Puranas, so he's a very Vedas, but in a different part of India. The Vedas are in what is now Haryana, and Rama was from eastern UP and then went to the south and so on. He didn't come through Vedic territory. But it must be that area. Now, whether, there was a story with his wife being abducted and so on, we don't really know. That's never written anywhere except in the Ramayana. But it's quite likely. I mean, abductions of wives are a very occurrence throughout history. That's probably historical. Then what he did, Anaras and Lanka and so on, there I don't speak out, But in the case of the Mahabharata, this is real history. It's also not called a kavya, it's called itihasa. It's not a poem, it's history. And so it's not real history in a modern sense, but it's certainly based on a real historic. This war of succession, the Bharata clan, actually took place. Then the story is woven around it. Now that's largely literary elaboration and so on, but the basis certainly is historical. Krishna, Yudhishthira, and so on are real historic. Now, it's a long debate that I don't want to get lost in here, but I am very sure that it is later than 2000 BC. So the classical date, or the now most common date of 3139 BC, that is definitely not correct. And this you can see archaeology. There are many elements in the Mahabharata, 3100 and something. Like a number of the cities, Indraprastha and so on, the second millennium, they didn't agree. Then the Sarasvati River dried up in about 1900 BC. You can see in several instances that we are already dealing with the dried up Sarasvati, which has shriveled down, shrunk to a fairly small river that doesn't go the whole course down to the ocean. Then the materials they use. You know, the central part of the storyline is a chariot battle. Now, war chariots didn't exist in 3000 BC. They are from about 2000 BC. Again, we have archaeology to confirm it. Anyway, then there is astronomy. There is a lot made about astronomy. So many of the arguments I don't even know. But I do know a very decisive element, namely the death of Bhishma. He himself has the boon choosing the moment of his death, and he wants to die after the winter solstice. And so he says, when Magha arrives, the month of Magha, which has the full moon, star Magha, or Regulus, then the winter solstice has passed. Now, the passing of this star Magha over the sun is known, it can be dated. It happened in 2240 thereabouts BC. Later than 2300 BC. So much, much later than 3100 BC. Right? So I think the Mahabharata happened, according to the book, it happened on the 8th day of the month of Magha, which was after the solstice. Now, 8 days, the distance covered by the sun is covered by the precession movement in about 500 years. So the Mahabharata take place prior to 1800 BC. It's one of the centuries after that. And there are very many theories about 1748 and 1200, and that I don't speak out on. But it's certainly the second millennium. Now, a true historical element in the Mahabharata concerns Vyasa. Vyasa is a logical grandfather of the protagonists Arjuna, Dhritarashtra, and so on. So this is like very shortly before the war. Vyasa is the man who completes the Vedas. He doesn't write the Vedas, but he puts them in the right order. He's the editor. That's what Vyasa means, because his real name is Krishna Dvaipayana. So you have the Vedas end in maybe 1700 BC or thereabouts, a bit after 2000 BC. This means that the oldest Veda, the Rig Veda, it has only its 10th book in this late period. The other books are centuries older. So the Rig Veda can climb back to 3000, even more BC. And so that, I think, is fairly solid. That fits with all the archaeological data. It fits with the many astronomical data concerning the Vedas, some Hitas at least. But there are a number that help in dating the Brahmanas, also the Yajur Veda. And so they all fall about or after the 2250 thereabouts BC. So you can see that much of the bulk of the Vedic literature actually is just before the Mahabharata war, and is still used and worked on by Vyasa. But the family books of the Rig Veda, they are centuries older. And that's why they are so useful in reconstructing this history, because they reach back to the era when Indo European unity was falling apart. After another was leaving India, was leaving the Urheimat, the homeland.
All right, Dr. Elst, again. Yeah. So, Dr. Elst, I have a couple of more questions, and then I want to ask us some questions that I had more specifically about linguistics. So, there are a couple of questions about on archaeology. So, somebody wants to know: do you have any reports on why excavation in the Sarasvati Valley has slowed down so much? I mean, what's your view? Don't you think we'll find a lot more under those deltas, or is just bureaucratic, pushback in India? Also, somebody wants to know, this is more a socio-political question, where they want to know that do you think when the indigenous populations of the erstwhile colonized countries start indigenous revival movements, the traditional colonial apologist historians tend to push back with the fear of getting exposed? And do you think that also kind of leads to a lot of influence in Indian archaeological research too?
Well, I am all for Indian national aspect, taking hold of archaeological research. I don't think that is going to make much difference in the motivation, whether Indian or foreign, because if we archaeologists, they are dead. India was 75 or so. Not an issue anymore. And in Western universities, they convinced themselves of a post-colonial. It is true that colonial prejudices are lingering, but it is enough to judge, and Western academics will hurry to free themselves of those biases. So, Hindus have a tendency to live in the past because it's self-flattering. You had the colonizers, and they were the bad guys. They were stealing from you. Now, and so therefore that themselves for the equation as if continuing till today. It is not. If there is not much progress, it is partly due to external circumstances. In the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, there's so much disorder, there's civil war and so on going on. There is also a paucity of means. India is now finally economically coming into its own. It can invest more in these somewhat luxury pastimes like archaeological research. In India, you have another problem, which is indeed of the bureaucracy. There are many sticky fingers, making it difficult to reach the funds earmarked for research to actually. But I mean, I'm optimistic about it, and I must call the Indian archaeologists for the work done. So they have already mapped out the Harappan civilization to quite an extent. They have also shown that there is really no trace of an Aryan invasion. Not of a military invasion, but not even of an influx of a new culture with new implements and new ways of living and so on. It's just not there. Every change that takes place there can be explained by local developments. So, the problem certainly is not Indian archaeologists. And a few Western archaeologists also are of the same conviction that there's no trace of an Aryan invasion. It is a problem that the decision in the West lies mostly with the linguists, who don't know anything about what is going on in India. And so, a little anecdote: I was about 5 years ago at a conference of Indian archaeologists, and really all the big names were there. And by the Indian archaeology, the or there is going to be 100 BB. And so one after paper about their digging in Caliban or in Dholavira or all these Harappan sites. And one after another, they came to say, no trace of an Aryan invasion. Now, at that same time, I was, I don't follow all these technical archaeology things so much. So I was having a little conversation on my computer with a top linguist in America. And just a pure coincidence, he said, come on, let's talk about the invasion. Has Hindu fundamentalists and saying that India is the home. Nobody believes that. Everybody knows there was an Aryan invasion. Now, all these who in academic rank, I mean, I think that's a real criterion, but for academics it is. So people of equal academic rank, deans of departments and so on, they were all saying, no, there was no Aryan invasion. And this fellow in America did the opposite. Now, this can happen in science. When you're looking for there may be theories for some. But then what you do normally is to sit together and discuss it and find out, and maybe earmark funds for some specific research that might give the answer to some specific question. And so after a while, you have the answer. And you can agree on the answer. Now, this is not happening. Why? Because there is a stonewalling of any out of India findings by the side that believes in the Aryan invasion.
All right, Dr. Elst, now I have a few questions very specific about linguistics, such as, so, so what's your opinion on the validity of the Proto Indo European vocabulary? As in, I'll give you an example. So how do you calculate the weightage, let's say, to, individual daughter languages to come up with the extrapolated Proto Indo European language? I mean, it seems like there is a priori assumption of Aryan invasion theory being true, which sometimes, to me, when I read books, it seems like, it kind of skews the phonemes in the Proto Indo European towards Europe. Do you think that is the case?
Well, not really. You see, the Indo European family concept was established in the late 18th century. For 50 years, everybody believed in the out of India theory. So, of course, this concept does not presuppose the Aryan invasion theory. The Aryan invasion theory came much later. And so the concept of Indo-European owes absolutely nothing to the Aryan invasion idea. The Aryan invasion idea came later, and within the extant possibilities, it was not an unreasonable guess. It was a mistaken guess, but okay, it's a possibility. After all, they were talking about what happened 5,000 years earlier in an area with no script and so on. Of course, at that time, they underestimated the age of the Veda. But so on the whole, you see, it was an illiterate territory in Russia. Suppose the homeland was in Russia. Well, between the time of the homeland and of Indo-European and the time of the first writing in Russia, there is 4,000 years, right? So, they were groping in the dark. They had to do with very few data. And so gradually they started this reconstruction of European. It took quite some time. And later, new discoveries, like the discovery of Hittite, the discovery of Tocharian, of Proto-Bangani, and so on, came to add pieces to the puzzle, and it became gradually more clear. But so in 1850, they had to work with very little, and at that time, the favor fell on the Aryan invasion theory. Now that theory, it was only a hypothesis, but that was then strongly reinforced by the New World situation. Why? In the time of this Indomania in Europe, when they thought European culture came from India and so on, India was still a large, heavily populated, rich country in the distance that everybody went to in order to trade with it. Like the East India Company initially only had a trading post in Bengal, and they kept up of paying obeisance to the Mughal Empire. And so they kept on playing, keeping the Indian power equation intact while silently grabbing more and more power. And then suddenly they could, install the Raj, the British colonial rule. But so until then, India was not a colony. And India was respected and looked up to. Like, for instance, there is an interesting theory that the discovery of differential and integral calculus in Europe by Leibniz and by Newton actually owed a lot to the information that the Jesuits staying in India were sending home, that they had learned from the Koenraad School of Mathematics. We also know that new industrial procedures used in England, and very important in the realization of the Industrial Revolution, were actually taken from India, and so on. So India was very well respected. Then, halfway the 19th century, India fell from grace and became an ordinary colony. And it was impoverished, these economic policies. So we're not the same thing anymore. And then it became easy to take India for granted. And so all the next speculations about Indo-European history more or less bypass India. And so, like what I said about Maria Gimbuta's theory about the Indo-Europeans invading from Russia and overrunning Europe, that caught the attention because that concerned Europe. And everybody was busy at that time with Europe. India was more or less forgotten about. And then, not coincidentally, when India comes back to the fore around 1990, almost literally coinciding with Narasimha Rao's change or liberalized economic policy, shaking all of socialism. Just India is coming into its own again, Just then, India stands up for itself and reclaims the attention for India itself. I don't know if that was an answer.
No,
Willing to
so
say
so I
more?
have a follow up. Dr. Els. Now here's the thing: when you read David Anthony
Yes, okay.
or Asep Elsweg, so what I have noticed is that their line of argument is that this is the Proto Indo European grammar, and this is the Proto Indo European vocabulary. They have a word for horse, they have a word for chariot, and etc. etc. And then they look at the archaeology, and then they say, okay, this is the archaeology in South Russia. This is the archaeology in this area, and these are the words that come up in the Proto Indo European vocabulary. So the natural homeland has to be South Russia. What do you have to say about that?
Well, the question is about the relation between ancient vocabulary and the ancient people were living, which is called paleontology. If I understood your question right. So here, linguists have tried to construct the world in which the ancient Indo-Europeans lived by looking at their vocabulary. For instance, in about 1870, and one of the first words that caught the attention was the word beech, Latin fagus. So beech trees only grow in Western Europe. And so they said, oh, yeah, the fact that this existed shows that the homeland must have been in Western Europe. Now, that didn't take long because we realized that names of trees easily adapt to new environments. If you migrate to a country where a certain tree doesn't exist anymore, but other trees, turn up, come into your horizon, then the name shifts to those new trees. And effectively, in Greek, you don't have beech trees, but you do have oak trees. The same word means an oak. So, more weighty, the argument that it was not in Northern Europe, or at any rate, some north, the number of northern animals appeared in the vocabulary, namely words for wolf and bear and lynx. It so happens that these animals also exist in India. In fact, I've been to a wildlife park in Goa where they had not only elephants and tigers, but also bears. And at any rate, even in a hot country like India, have a cold climate, like here. And so you find lots of cold area wildlife in India, namely in the cold areas. Like, for instance, in Kashmir, you have the birch tree, which is the English birch. So you don't find it in tropical parts of India, but you do find it in India, right? So this argument, all these northern animals indicate a northern climate, that just doesn't work. Whereas the opposite argument is more impressive. If you find animals typical of a hot climate, now in the cold parts of the world, you do not sense of hot climate. You don't giraffes or elephants in Northern Europe. Okay, well, what turns out to be the case? There are words, Indo-European words for lion, for leopard, for ape, and most impressively for elephant. And so you have the Sanskrit word for elephant that you find back in Greek, in Latin, and you also find it back in Germanic, but with a different meaning, namely a camel. And this is logical because when the ancestors of the Germans left India where they knew elephants, they had the word for elephant. They came into Afghanistan with no elephants anymore, but camels. They were new to them. So they transferred the word for elephant to the word for camel. And so they took that with them as the word for camel. And as Talageri, he has a really detailed demonstration about the word elephant. As he points out, in the whole expanse of Indo-European, there is only one country with elephants. There are no elephants in Italy or in Russia or so. Then there are elephants outside Indo-European territory, in China, in Indonesia, and so on, but that is out of the picture. You see no Indo-European there. There's elephants. So, to the extent that linguistic paleontology proves anything, it would prove India. Then,
all right, Dr. Elst,
another.
I'm sure.
Yeah?
I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, well, just one more example. And this does not have to do with flora and fauna, but with technology. There is one technological invention that was meant for the Proto Indo European people, and that, in my opinion, is the secret of their successful expansion, namely the wagon. You find 6 different words, each for parts of the wagon, in practically all the Indo-European languages. So it already existed in Proto-Indo-European. You have the axis, the wheel, the yoke, and so. Now, this means that the Indo-Europeans invented the wheel, they invented the cart, they invented the chariot. And this is very important for their expansion. You see, in the 90s, for a short while, there was a theory by the British archaeologist Colin Renfrew that said that the homeland was in Anatolia, where agriculture originated. And he thought that Indo-European had spread along with agriculture. This was a new invention, very demographically beneficial, because you could control your own food supply. So he found a mechanism for the expansion of Indo-European. Namely, it rode piggyback on the expansion of agriculture. Now, for several reasons, his theory is untenable, in the sense that Anatolia cannot be the source of the one Indo-European language spoken there, Hittite, is an immigrant language with many borrowings, cultural vocabulary, and so on from the local language. And so on. There are archaeological reasons too. But the interesting thing about his theory, one element that remains, is that he gave a reason why a language expanded. It was not just a band of bored young men who, on horseback, started conquering a neighboring city or so. No, there was a mechanism, expanding agriculture, a long-term, large-scale mechanism. Well, the invention of the wagon was something of that order. So that made possible much larger expansions than had hitherto happened. Because if you conquer a place with a band of young men, okay, you can take the city, and then what? You marry the local women, you have children raised by those women in their own. And so, except for maybe a few terms, the local language is going to remain, and you're going to assimilate. You'll be in power, all right, but you'll become one of them. Whereas what the Indo, and they took their own language with them. Why? Because they took their families with them. And that's what you need wagons for. Whereas the young men are out there on horseback, you see the women and children are inside the wagon. So that makes a lot of difference. At any rate, you see this wagon technology was there. So if perforce you want to be proud of something as an Indo-European, okay, you could too late to invent the fire, but at least we invented the wheel.
All right, Dr. Elst, I have
Okay,
a couple of more questions.
finished.
I
So
have two more
question.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, like they say, the Rig Veda and the Aranyakas have a strong memory-dependent transmission system, right? So they basically were transmitted all these years
Hmm.
by people reciting the mantras again and again. Now, in such a scenario, do you think such a system could have been made up by pastoralists, or those who need to be mobile on horses, or it seems like a stable society where food security is taken care of and the rishis were taken care of, and because it was a stable uh agri urban kind of a setup where everything was kind of stable, that these kinds of things were possible?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Now, you should not really see antagonism between these two. You see, nomadic cattle herders are usually effect of a developing and so they already knew sedentary, they were familiar, sense a part of it. They were the more nomadic part of it. And so you find arguments for nomadism, for non-urban culture in the Rig Veda. First of all, they are clearly cattle raisers. It's totally to the then the fact that they don't have idols, or well, idol is a bit of a Western term. Let's use, the Arya Samaj, the Veda fundamentalists from the late 19th century, they used to make a big thing out of this, say that, oh, they're not in favor of Murti Puja and we shouldn't do Murti Puja and so on. Well, I have nothing against Murti Puja, but in that particular part of the Hindu tradition, that is the Vedas, there indeed you don't find Murti Puja. Now, Murti Puja is typical for a sedentary lifestyle. You can build a temple, whereas what nomads do, for them the spoken word is far more important, because that you can take with you. And that indeed is what the Vedic people have excelled in. But so I think that it was a bit of a combination of the two, which is not a weasel solution. No, that's a realistic historical solution, because people live shadow of. So that's exactly what you find in North India. You find these Harappan cities by the riverside, but then you find people, and so there is certainly room for nomadic cattle raisers. The Vedic rishis, I mean, you have people like the Nagas who are wandering ascetics. They are already mentioned in the Rig Veda, but they are clearly mentioned in the third person. They are not the ones who write the Vedas. The Vedic composers were court priests. They were members of the elite of their society. They were not on the contrary. So you see, they were sociologically a different category, but they were part of a very, complex society where perhaps they were not the urban dwellers, but they had a certain important function within the whole setup. And so the choice must be made between sedentary and nomadic. These two go together. But so very probably we do not have to do with the urban dwellers. You see, they had other forms of art, of expressing their ideas, than the spoken word. But yes, I mean, I agree that level of organization of the spoken word, with this all these mnemotechnic devices, you see, to keep the tones totally intact, to avoid any changes creeping in and so on. That indicates at least a very well organized society. That's not a band of wild nomads on the road, not at all.
All right, Dr. Elst, now Anna, my last question. This is going to be on linguistics again. So a lot of people
Yeah.
are keen to know. So is there any way is there any paper you can suggest which can, explain the spread of Indian languages in comparison to European languages, mathematically, and also on the evolution of Indian languages in comparison to European languages, and is their evolution similar, or are they unique, or where do we stand in terms of the languages that are spoken in India right now? Are the principles the same in terms of the development of the language itself, and
Yeah.
beyond mathematical state? I know, I remembered, because you named Colin Renfrew. The whole Asya Pelsweg book is basically a rebuttal to a recent paper that had come up mapping the origins, and they look at it in a Bayesian way, like a Bayesian hypothesis, kind of a method. So are there any papers that we can refer to if we wanted to understand this even more?
Yeah. I have to confess, I don't know much about languages as such. Sanskrit and Hindi and a bit of Pali. Also taken a course to read Tirukural and so on. I forgot all of it, but nevertheless, with that much I'm familiar. But you see, all this variety of Bhasha and Bengali and Gujarati and so on, I know strictly nothing. So generalities, and these are important to know. It is not true that Sanskrit, just as it is not true, there's a perfect parallel, just as it is not true that all the varieties of Hinduism, all the different descendants from the Vedas. The Vedic tradition of the Paurava tribe, I didn't say Kaurava, I said Paurava, the tribe of Puru, the 5 sons of Yayati. So the Puru tribe, they lived in the Sarasvati basin in Haryana, and so the Vedas are their people. They mean themselves, they mean the Purus. They don't mean the Yadavas, they don't mean the Anavas, not the Ikshvakus, they mean only their own tribe. Later, because it was an impressive intellectual lens to see everything. This culture of learning by heart, of a specific meter and so on, then became the backbone of a number of around it, like astronomy, grammar, mathematics, and so on. So that became a prestigious intellectual tradition that started to get taken over by all the other traditions. And so, the cult of the mother goddess, it's of course available in every village in India. It's mainly centered in the northeast, Bengal, Assam, or the cult of puja, or the culture of asceticism, of meditation, or even reincarnation and so on, mainly, but not exclusively, mainly centered in Magadha, where later Jainism and Buddhism are going to emerge. You see, all these come under the wings of the Vedic culture. So they start to reformulate themselves in terms of, and then it's a new meaning, namely Vedic. Originally it means we, us, Purus. Later it gets the meaning Puru as seen from the others. And Vedic, the Vedic tradition, the tradition of the Purus. Yeah? So Arya becomes a more general term. So the Vedic religious tradition starts to become pan-Hindu. Similarly, their language, Sanskrit, is only one of the languages in North India at the time. So you have different dialects in Magadha, in what becomes Gujarat, and so on. Dialects become the ancestor of Gujarati, of Oriya, of Bengali, and so on. Not Sanskrit itself. They are not descendants of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is their aunt, not their mother. So that's an important thing to understand about the Indo European languages. They are descendants of one common ancestor, Sanskrit. That's what the Aryan Invasion theory would make you believe, because that says the Aryans entered India from outside, Punjab, Haryana. There they composed the Vedas, and then they spread out over the rest of India. And so all of them are descendants from this group that composed the Vedas. Well, that's not correct, because they were already spread out in North India even before the Vedas began. And so the picture in terms of linguistics. There was already quite a scope of Indo-Aryan languages, and so the modern languages are descendants from that whole array, just from Sanskrit. Otherwise, there is not very much I can say about the modern Indian languages. I mean, I just confess that Antalagiri knows a lot more. Otherwise, there's not much I can say about this. But do read, if you want to know about that specifically. Again, go to Talagiri's blog site. There are a number of interesting papers about that. So yes, you see, that much should be worked out in more detail, but it has fairly limited relevance for the homeland question, because the homeland question starts earlier, before you have a split up in Indo-Aryan, Iranian, and so on. So that's the stuff I prefer doing. But yes, of course, it's important. And so this is one of the many aspects of the affair where Indian scholars can make all the difference.
All right, Dr. Elst, before I let you go today, I just have one last question. Are there any current books, new books that you're writing, or are there any projects that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I have written a paper for the Festschrift, the festive present book given to my erstwhile professor of Indo European linguistics, who now pensioner. And so that paper is still under embargo, but as soon as the book comes out, which is in 2-3 months, then I'll spread the paper. And it's quite important because it gives an overview of the present day state of the debate. Because, we have covered quite some distance. Many people, don't see the forest for the trees. They know about some specific findings, and they concentrate on the archaeology, the Harappan cities, or the genetic debate or so. They don't have an overview over where this debate is going. And that's what I try to provide in this paper. Then about, for the moment, I'm concentrating on other topics. So about the question, years ago, my book came out, Still No Trace of an Aryan Invasion. That is still quite valid. And the foreword to Shrikant Talageri's book, in answer to Tony Joseph's book, arguing that now finally genetics has proven the Aryan Invasion. There's no such thing. The Indian secularist press are now pretending, the Hindutva crowd is embarrassed because now the Aryan Invasion has been proven. This is just their imagination. So we are advancing, that I can tell you. But so books on the linguistic aspect, yeah, there is one more, of course, that's Nicholas Kazonas, who's a Greek Sanskritist. And that's important because he used to be a teacher of the Aryan Invasion theory. Because, all Sanskritists in Europe were, they didn't know anything else. And so when he started studying this more deeply and also hearing about the new developments in India, he saw that what he had hitherto considered as a proof of the Aryan invasion was in fact only an application of the Aryan invasion theory. It didn't prove the theory at all. And so you could start all over, do without the Aryan invasion theory, and still get a harmonious explanation of everything. So he decided, no, there was no Aryan invasion. He and in the field of archaeology, B.B. Lal, are two very important figures because they sides. There is no case of anyone changing side in the other direction. There is no one who left the Indian homeland theory and chose the westerly homeland theory. There's no such case. But there are two people, well, many more, but certainly those two big ones in the opposite direction. So B.B. Lal, he's the one who was cited from 1950 onwards as the one archaeologist who had given archaeological proof for the Aryan invasion theory. Mind you, the linguists themselves, maybe the followers, those who don't know very well, but certainly not the academics, the ones who really know the stuff, they don't claim that linguistics has proven the Aryan invasion theory. Some may say that it's likely, there are indications, blah, blah. Nobody is as pretentious as to say we have proven the Aryan invasion theory. And so my own professor of Indo European linguistics said, this Aryan invasion theory has been proven. No, not by linguistics, but, there is archaeological proof. And at the time, you see, what he said was correct, because most people in this field believed that B.B. Lal's discovery of the painted gray ware, which he identified as typical for the Aryans moving deeper into India, that gave the proof of the Aryan theory. In fact, and it took B.B. Lal himself some 30 years or so to really realize it. In fact, this only applied then dominant paradigm, which was the Aryan invasion theory, but didn't prove it. And so he revised his findings and he saw, well, no, you see, this doesn't prove any Aryan invasion. It proves that there were people there, people whom we call Aryans, but, there's no indication that they came from anywhere. There's no trail outside that they came from Russia, Afghanistan, and so on. No, it's a purely Indian. So now, of course, at age 99, he's very firm in saying Vedic and Harappan are two sides of the same coin. Of course, there was no Aryan invasion. So the same thing at the linguistic level with Nicholas Kazonas. Now, Nicholas Kazonas has published 2 books, I think, from Aditya Prakashan, and they are certainly worth it. Yes.
All right, Dr. Elst, I think I've taken enough of your time, so we can wrap things up today. I once again want to thank you for giving us your time and educating us. I hope this will be first of the many conversations that I have with you, because I know once this chat is done, I'm going to be bombarded with emails and furthermore questions about what you have told us today about Aryan invasion and out of India theory. So once again, Dr. Elst, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast, and I hope to have many more conversations with you in the future.
Yes, all right. It was my pleasure. आपसे मिलकर मुझे बहुत प्रसन्नता हुई. अगली बार फिर मिलेंगे.
बहुत बढ़िया. All right, guys, time to wrap up today's discussion. if you like what I'm doing over here, please like the video, share the video, leave your comments. If you have any questions, I would request you to send me an email at contact@kushalmehra.com. I can, I can forward those questions to Dr. Elst. Also, if you want to support the Charbagh podcast, please become a member on YouTube, or you can go to patreon.com and, pledge support over there. You can buy the Charbagh podcast merch, and also you can send donations directly through UPI. I try my best to have as many discussions as possible. I will come back with another such interesting discussion. Until then, namaste, take care, goodbye, see you next time.